All right, today we are diving deep into a real geopolitical puzzle. We're talking about Pakistan's shadow war, its really complicated relationship with the Taliban, and this strategy it has. A strategy that seems to swing wildly between dropping bombs and holding peace talks.
And yeah, that brings us right to the big question, doesn't it? Why? Why does Pakistan seem to switch tactics on a dime? One minute, you're hearing about airstrikes and major military operations. The next, it's all about ceasefires and negotiations. Is this just chaos? Or is there actually some kind of logic behind it all? Let's get into it.
So, the first thing you've got to understand is that this isn't just random. It might look like it, but it's actually a playbook. A very deliberate and, you could say, very risky playbook that's been developed over decades of conflict. Think of this strategy as having two sides of the very same coin. On one hand, you've got coercion. So when the threat from a group like the TTP gets too hot, Pakistan hits back, and hits back hard. We're talking air raids, ground troops, the whole thing. But then, when that force becomes too expensive or just isn't working, the playbook flips. Suddenly it's all about engagement, ceasefires, releasing prisoners, and trying to talk things out. It's this constant back and forth between the stick and the carrot.
Okay, so where did this playbook even come from? Well, to get a handle on the paradox we see today, we have to rewind the clock. We need to look at a tangled history of disputed borders, proxy wars, and alliances that are constantly shifting. It's a history that really shaped this entire region. There are a few key moments that really set the stage for all of this. It kicks off way back in 1893 with something called the Durand Line, this old colonial border that Afghanistan has, well, never really accepted. Flash forward to 1979, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan completely changes the game, making Pakistan a frontline state. That leads us to the 1990s and the rise of the Taliban, who, by the way, were initially backed by Pakistan. And then, of course, 2001, the US invasion throws everything into the air again.
Let's just focus on that first point for a second, the Durand Line. You know, it's so much more than just a line on a map. It literally sliced right through the heart of the Pashtun tribal homeland. What that created was a porous 2,600-kilometer border that's just about impossible to control. For more than a century now, it's been a superhighway for people, for weapons, and for ideologies to flow back and forth. Now, that Soviet invasion in the 80s, that was the moment Pakistan's powerful intelligence agency, the ISI, stepped onto the world stage. With a ton of backing from the US and Saudi Arabia, the ISI trained and armed the Mujahideen fighters. In doing so, it forged these incredibly deep connections with militant networks and gave Pakistan something it always wanted: strategic depth. Basically, influence in Afghanistan to use as a buffer against its arch-rival, India.
And all of that history, all those connections, they led to this really crucial and super controversial idea that is the key to understanding everything that comes next. It's the idea of a good Taliban versus a bad Taliban. So here's how they sliced it, at least in theory. For years, the Pakistani security establishment saw the Afghan Taliban as the good Taliban. They were a strategic asset, a tool for keeping influence in Kabul. But the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP, they were the bad Taliban. Why? Because they're a totally separate group that turned its guns on Pakistan itself, making them a domestic enemy. Now here's the problem. These groups, they often share the same ideology, family ties, and hideouts. That line between good and bad gets really, really blurry. And that has had some absolutely disastrous consequences. And this quote just hits the nail on the head. The result of this blurry line is something called blowback. The very same networks that Pakistan supported to achieve its foreign policy goals ended up mutating and splintering, creating homegrown insurgent groups like the TTP, who have killed tens of thousands of Pakistanis. The tools of foreign policy became a devastating threat at home.
Now, let's look at a pretty recent and really dramatic example of this whole playbook crashing and burning: the failed attempt to resettle TTP militants back in 2022. I mean, this whole episode just ripped the lid off the deep fractures inside Pakistan's own leadership. So here's the setup. After the Afghan Taliban took over Kabul in 2021, attacks inside Pakistan by the TTP just skyrocketed. So by 2022, that bomb then talk playbook gets pulled off the shelf. But this time, it wasn't just about a ceasefire. A really controversial idea was floated. What if we resettle thousands of these TTP fighters and their families back inside Pakistan? And this is where it gets really messy. It turns out there wasn't just one plan, there were two, and they were basically at war with each other. The civilian government, which was led by Imran Khan at the time, was thinking about a public political reconciliation process. trying to turn these fighters back into citizens. But the military establishment, they were reportedly running a totally separate, secret operation. Their goal was different. It was to contain the threat by moving these guys to places where they could be watched. So you've got two plans with totally different goals and methods, and absolutely zero transparency between them.
The result? Well, it was a complete and utter disaster. As TTP militants started showing up again in places like the Swat Valley, the local people were terrified. You had these huge protests break out, led by figures like the politician Murad Saeed. Instead of bringing peace, TTP attacks went through the roof. And in the end, what happened? The civilian government and the military just pointed fingers at each other, completely shattering any trust that might have been left between them. So this massive failure left Pakistan in a really tough spot. It feels like the old playbook is broken, but figuring out a new way forward is incredibly complicated, thanks to some long-standing realities of the region. And the biggest complication of all is what we can call the India factor. You see, for Pakistan strategists, every single move they make is weighed against their rivalry with India. So the idea of a full-scale war in Afghanistan to wipe out TTP's safe havens, that's seen as way too risky. And why is that? Because it could create a power vacuum, one that they fear India could exploit to gain influence in Kabul. It's this deep-seated fear that often prevents them from taking really decisive military action. So if all-out war is off the table and just talking hasn't worked, what's left? Well, some experts are proposing a kind of middle path that avoids both extremes. It has about 4 key parts. First, very precise, targeted strikes against high-level TTP leaders. Second, a real, verifiable process of what's called disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, or DDR. Third, you have to systematically choke off the TTP's money and supplies. And fourth, and this is the long game, you have to invest in local governance to win the people back. Okay, so I just used that acronym DDR. Let's quickly break down what it means. It stands for disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. And look, this isn't just about collecting a bunch of guns. It's a really complex, coordinated process to actually disband armed groups and help former fighters find a way back into normal civilian life. It is incredibly hard to pull off, but a lot of people think it's absolutely essential if you ever want lasting peace. And that really brings us to the final lingering question here. This middle path, it sounds logical, right? It makes sense on paper. But is it actually possible? Can a strategy that requires so much precision and so much trust actually work in a region that's been defined by decades of proxy wars and just bottomless mistrust? That remains the unanswered question at the very heart of Pakistan's shadow war.